Hello and welcome to The Political Orphanage, a show for jolly, deep thinkers, square pegs, round holes, and pirates. I'm Andrew Heaton, and today's an awesome episode. I enjoyed this so much. I am a big fan of my guest, Musa al-Gharbi, not least of which because I just genuinely like the guy. He's such a dork. My guest is such a dork, but in a really good way. Like, half the time he's talking, it's an interesting chat. Half the time he's talking, I think to myself, we would have played Dungeons and Dragons together if we went to the same high school. And then part of me thinks, we may yet still. But that's not why today's episode is so fun, the chumminess. What makes the conversation so fascinating is that Musa has developed a comprehensive theory on what causes wokeness. Have you ever thought about that before? To put it another way, all the culture war stuff that we've been talking about this last decade, the so-called Great Awokening, what sparked it? And he's going to make a very good case that it's not the first time that this has happened. It's not unique. And if so, what causes the phenomenon? I'm one of those folks who tends to see wokeness as a kind of secular puritanism. And I basically still think that. But it's a fascinating question to ask, what is the instigating factor? Not the phenomenon itself, which is how I typically approach it on the show. What is happening? But rather, what triggered it? What caused it to happen? What changed to make it happen when it did, as opposed to 10 years prior? And if so, what might change in the future to precipitate the next Great Awokening? That's what we're going to dive into today, right here on The Political Orphanage. My guest today is Musa al-Gharbi. He's a sociologist at the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University, and he is the author of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. Hello, Musa.
Hey, it's great to be back.
It's great to see you again. I'm a fan of your work. I want you to quit doing whatever your day job is. Do less of it and write more newsletters because I really enjoy your newsletters.
Yeah, I should be putting out more of them as I'm done with this intense book preparation.
Well, it's a good book, and I see in the book and in your writing in general. I like that you're a data guy, and I also think that your mind just works differently than most people I know, and so in a good way. And so you end up tackling problems and tackling situations from a different perspective. So let's kick it off with this. You've got a book about wokeness and where it comes from. How do most people see the culture war, and how ought we to see the culture war?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of narratives about the kind of rapid shifts and conflicts, cultural conflicts that we saw after 2010. I think a lot of them are kind of demonstrably false. So, for instance, one popular narrative is that a lot of the tumult we've seen since in recent years is a result of kids these days, Gen Z, and their idiosyncratic attitudes and
college students. They're irritating.
Yeah. And so there are two problems with this narrative. One of them is that a lot of the changes that began, and when you look at shifts in media and public opinion and shifts in the Democratic Party platform and all of that, those shifts got underway when the oldest members of Gen Z were like 10. So they weren't the ones changing their academic outputs, and they weren't the ones guiding media coverage or entertainment outputs. They weren't the primary constituency that the Democratic Party was concerned about, a bunch of 10-year-olds. And so that there's just this timing problem. So there is a lot of research that suggests that contemporary Gen Z people do have importantly different attitudes about a lot of things in older cohorts, but that's not the driver. And the second major problem with that narrative is that if it was really Gen Z, then we wouldn't expect that we've had anything like this happen before. This should be something that only started when Gen Z came onto the fray. And one of the things that my book shows is that actually there have been many cases like this. Another popular story is that it's social media and cell phones and all
Right.
of this kind of stuff, these technological changes. And again, the problem there is that the timing actually doesn't line up well. A lot of the social media platforms and stuff were out for years before the Great Awakening really took off. And then there's the second problem that, in fact, there have been 3 previous episodes like this one over the last century that occurred in similar magnitude, similar in scope, very similar dynamics before we had social media or anything like that. And so one nice thing is when we kind of broaden the lens a little bit, when we look for, in a kind of data-focused way, on what changed after 2010, and is this something that's actually unique, or is it a case of something? We can see that it's actually a case of something, and it's not something, according to a lot of contemporary books, people like Christopher Rufo or Richard Hanania and others. They trace a lot of these shifts and tumult to the 1960s and say everything is basically downstream of, in Christopher Rufo's telling, it's downstream of a bunch of radicals ensconcing themselves in academic institutions. And again, a problem with that narrative is, well, it's definitely true that radicals, like former protesters and as the civil rights movement fizzled out and stuff like that, they tried to launch ethnic studies programs, gender and women's studies programs, and so on. But if you've ever been in a university, the gender and women's studies department isn't the one calling the shots. Like, university leaders aren't like, what should we do? Well, let me ignore the law school. Let me ignore the business school, the high enrollment schools that generate lots of revenue. Let me ignore the STEM departments, which bring in all these external grants and I'm going to ignore all of them. Let me focus on the low enrollment, these really niche gender and women's studies programs, and let them dictate to us how we operate. It's absolutely not anyone with like rudimentary like knowledge of how these institutions work would understand that it's actually things like the business schools and STEM departments and the law school and other things like that that really dictate how universities operate, not ethnic studies or anything like that. So that's the first problem. And the second problem, again, with starting the clock in the 1960s, is that there was a movement just like this in the 1920s. And I mean a lot like this. As I highlight in the book, a lot of the things that we think of as being new to the current moment actually go back rather a century. So I include quotes from George Orwell, writing at the tail end of the first Great Awakening in the 1920s through the early 30s, talking about things like cancel culture quite clearly. He says, when I look at left activism today, it seems like more than anything what it is people stomping to and fro to the beat of drums saying, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of a right-wing deviationist. Or even things like intersectionality. Again, from Orwell, writing in the 1930s, he talked about how the mere words communism and socialism seem to, almost like with magnetic force, draw to them every fruit juice drinker and sex deviants and all of these other people in England.
And you've got some Nixon quotes in there that I thought were funny, because Nixon's like, no, the first time this happened back in the 1950s, I thought it was a good. Hold on, I'm doing Jimmy Stewart. Hold on. I thought it was a good idea, but now these are rebels without a cause. They just want to burn down the house for the sake of burning the house down. There's no point to it. We've got to crack down on these leftists.
Yeah,
so, you definitely make a very compelling case that there is. We are within the 20 and 21st centuries. We're the third Great Awakening. That this is not something that is sui generis, but rather it's kind of a cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book, I argue that there, when we understand that this is a case of something, and we can ask ourselves different questions about it. Then, instead of trying to explain everything that's happening now in terms of other things that are also new and happening right now, we can look for deeper explanations. And so by comparing and contrasting these cases, I argue we can get leverage on, like, why do these awakenings happen at all? Why do they end? Do they change anything? What do they change? Does one inform the next one? How? And these kinds of questions. And so that's what I try to do in chapter 2 of the book, is kind of through comparing and contrasting these cases and walking readers through them, get leverage on these questions about why.
Right. Well, I want to get to all of that, but I also want to make sure I understand. I want to make sure I understand the basics before we go any further. So with the Great Awokening, you kind of, the one that we're currently living in or at the tail end of or whatever, you sort of date that as starting around 2010.
Yeah.
And so immediately we can already say that Trump did not cause it. He could be a catalyzing agent, but he's not a instigator of it because he comes later in the process of it. We
Absolutely.
can also say that it's not just kids that grew up with smartphones that are now in college, because it begins as they are 10 years old. So they are not the ones writing the articles. So we've already got some good data points that are very useful there.
And we can also rule out things like Me Too and Black Lives Matter. Like, it wasn't like Black Lives Matter kicked off this wave of activism that expanded to other identity groups or anything like that. And instead, it seems like the reason why Black Lives Matter and Me Too and these other movements were able to resonate, when so many of other movements that people had been trying to launch movements to address a lot of these problems for decades. And so the reason why it was able to break through this time, why they were able to achieve success when others, why they were able to achieve the level of kind of impact in the public sphere that they had when other ones didn't, was because of changes that were already underway. They kind of stepped into the scene when things were already shifting, when knowledge economy professionals, journalists, academics et al. Were already super concerned, heightened vigilance around social justice issues and things like this.
How do you pick 2010 as the start date for the Great Awakening? Because depending on what you define as the window is going to define whether or not Trump and social media and Gen Z are relevant to the instigating process or not. So why is 2010 the start date?
Yeah. So my colleagues and I, we basically figured out the start date by a bunch of nerdy data analysis. So my colleagues and I, for instance, published a paper where we analyzed 27 million news articles from 47 media outlets over the last 50 years. And we saw that after 2011, in that case, there was this rapid uptick in concern about prejudice and discrimination, pretty much all forms of prejudice and discrimination: homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, you name it, all of them at the same time, not corresponding to anything that seemed to be happening in the world. And we saw these rises in left, right, and center media alike, in television and print media alike. And then, you do similar things with academic articles, or if you look at public opinion polling, starting after 2010, you see these rapid shifts in how highly educated white liberal people especially answer. And so looking at a lot of these metrics, you can just see that there was this change after 2010.
Okay.
There's this kind of two-part shift that happened in this awakening, because the initial part of the Great Awakening was Occupy Wall Street. And we often don't think of that as the beginning of these, because when we think of the Great Awakening, we think of kind of identitarianism.
I think of Occupy Wall Street as more of like Bernie Sanders class warfare, whereas I think of the Great Awakening as this identitarian sexuality, racial justice kind of thing. So I think of the one as economic, and I think of the other one as social.
Yeah. So what I want to do in the book, and what I hope the book does, is put pressure on that idea, which is, I think, popular and not unreasonable. But what I show in the book is that when you look at who took part in the Occupy Wall Street protest, it was actually the same people who were doing March for Science, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all of these things. There's this narrative that Occupy Wall Street was this broad-based, class-oriented movement, but it wasn't. When you look at who actually participates in it, it was overwhelmingly highly educated, relatively affluent knowledge economy professionals, or people who wanted to be knowledge economy professionals. They were clustered in knowledge economy hubs. And even some of the narratives, the rhetoric around things like, we are the 99%, that's not really focusing on class in a meaningful way. As Richard Reeves pointed out, this narrative of we are the 99% allows people who make 250,000 a year, 100,000 a year to say, oh, I'm just a little guy. I'm just a regular Joe, just like the guy, just like the janitor who cleans my building. We're just in the same boat. And it's just Jeff Bezos.
I vacation in Europe twice a year, and I never take a private jet. I'm just a regular person. I fly business if I have the frequent flyer miles. Otherwise, I'm in Commons on my way to Milan with the rest of the proletariat.
Absolutely. And so, and in fact, even the kind of norms that governed Occupy Wall Street, like there was this militant resistance to actually like coming up with a policy platform, and they had these weird rules for all the meetings where you had to have the right people in the progressive stack that speak first. And all of this is kind of weird niche crap that's like definitive of academia and journalism and other knowledge economy spaces like this. This isn't like normie workers come down from the docks and they go, oh, well, let me, formulate this weird progressive stack procedure for who gets to talk.
We want higher pay is what they want. That's what the normies at the docks want. I can answer that. The normies at the docks want higher pay. There Absolutely. You go. I got it.
Absolutely. And so, it was this, kind of knowledge economy worker thing from the get-go as it fizzled out, as Occupy fizzled out, both because normie workers didn't take part and eventually they were driven from the park. They were occupying and other places like that. And the press moved on to other things. Then they focused on other social justice issues instead. But it's the same kind of social justice activism among the same people and driven by the same kinds of motives. Like when you look at what the Occupy people were actually fundamentally angry about, it was that they, pretty explicitly, it was that they had visions for their life that were not being fulfilled, and they blamed the rich, powerful, successful people for that. And they wanted to take those people down a peg and raise themselves up. Pretty explicitly, that was what Occupy was about. And that was also what Me Too and what I argue in the book is that was also what Me Too and Black Lives Matter and March for Science and all of these other things were fundamentally about, even though they didn't voice themselves in quite as transparent of a way.
So to play devil's advocate, a lot of people would say that Black Lives Matter was explicitly about racial justice and about criminal justice reform and police reform, and that Me Too was about a feminist reckoning and the patriarchy and really bad practices that had infiltrated Hollywood and government and other things. And those were the explicit no one was making any bones about it. Those were the explicit points of those particular things. So how do you reconcile that with displaced knowledge workers?
Yeah. So there's kind of two things to focus on there. I think one of them is like who's taking part in supporting the movements, but then even the movements themselves. So when you look at Black Lives Matter, for instance, the Black Lives Matter organization was notorious for basically the people who founded it would just like show up to protests that they didn't organize, get themselves in front of the media, hover up a bunch of money out of the communities that were affected by police brutality and hoard that money for themselves and spend it on themselves and their while the families who were suffering and lost loved ones and stuff basically got nothing from Black Lives Matter for years and years and years until eventually they were in fact there were these big exposés about Black Lives Matter and their financial mismanagement. And when you look at who was running Black Lives Matter, they were all people with advanced degrees and mostly advanced degrees from elite schools, others with just four-year degrees from elite schools.
Well, before I lose track of this, then I want to go back. So we've got you've convinced me on the dates. 2010 is going to be the start point for this, and there's a sort of nascent phenomenon happening with Occupy Wall Street that keeps going. Okay, I'm with you. You mentioned that there are other Great Awakenings, and that by looking at those, we can begin to see that this is a phenomenon rather than an event.
And I think actually this is a good way to get to this question you asked about, like, okay. So, so what I argue in the book is there are kind of two factors if you want to predict when an awakening will happen. One of them is that they occur during these periods of elite overproduction. So that's an idea that I drew from Peter Turchin, a historian, and Jack Goldsmith, a sociologist. And basically what they argue is that what the elite overproduction is is when society is producing more people who have a reasonable expectation that they will be elites, but society doesn't have the capacity to give them the elite lifestyles that they're expecting or hoping for. So when you have growing numbers of people who did everything right, they got good grades, they stayed in school, they got good grades, they went to the right schools even, they graduated in the right majors, and all of this kind of stuff. But instead of enjoying a six-figure income that they assumed that they would get when they graduated from then instead they find themselves underemployed or unemployed or working kind of contingent, low-status jobs. And when you have growing numbers of elites that find themselves in that condition, that feel the social contract that they had expected was broken in some way, what they do is they kind of turn their humiliation and their outrage and their sadness and stuff like this towards the people who are being successful in the prevailing order. They try to indict the order that they think that failed them and try to kind of tear the successful people down to make room for themselves. The problem is that elites often have when they find themselves in a tight spot or facing a lot of overproduction is that, as my advisor Seamus Khan and others have argued, the fortunes of elites and non-elites tend to operate countercyclically, which is to say, when times are kind of good for elites, they tend to be kind of rough for everyone else because they have they can have more extractive leverage over other people and things like that.
Wait, so if I'm understanding that right, let us hypothesize. We'll get to what an elite is in a minute.
Yeah.
And I want to get there, by the way. So let's say for a moment that I succeed, I become elite, I've achieved my goal. I'm not just dressing like one, I'm living like one. If I'm doing really well, labor's cheap, and so the stuff I want to buy is cheap. Is that basically it? Like if I want
during periods of time when elites tend to be doing especially well, yeah, they tend to be times that are really relatively tough for workers. They have where employers have a lot more leverage over. They're able to squeeze more productivity out of them than they normally wouldn't. And actually, on the flip side, times that are bad for elites tend to be pretty good for workers. And we saw this after COVID, for instance, where a lot of companies, because they had employment shortages, were forced to increase wages, increase benefits, and all of this other kind of stuff. All
the talks about how America's become an economic hellscape. The data over the last 3 years has been great for it. The gains have been in lower quintiles, not upper quintiles.
And in fact, you've seen suppression in upper quintiles. So there's been And so those were times that were bad for elites but good for workers, and that's actually the norm. There's this normal counter-cyclical. So just real quick, so this is a problem for elites because if times are hard for them, usually it's hard to get anyone to care. If times are bad for you, but they're good for most other people, no one's breaking out a tiny violin to say, oh, poor elite guy has to work a normal job like everyone else and live a normal life like everyone else. It's only, but there are these moments when the trajectories collapse, when things have been kind of bad and growing worse for ordinary people for a while, and all of a sudden they're bad for a lot of elites too. And those are the moments when awakenings tend to happen, because not only then do elites have a motive to indict the prevailing order, but they have a lot more leverage because there's a lot of other people around them who are also pissed off, who also want big change, who are also, looking to indict. And so they have a lot more clout than they normally would to kind of carry out their campaigns against.
This is fascinating. And reading your book blew my mind, by the way, because I've always approached Great Awakenings as an awakening, right? My undergraduate was in history and religious studies. And so my inclination, I think with pretty good reason, is to look at wokeness as a nascent religion, as a secular religion, as a theological phenomenon that's occurring. And I think in many ways it is, but you're making an excellent case that the instigating factor is actually socioeconomic. And I want to make sure that I understand what's going on here. So theoretically, let's say there's a major push to get people to go to theater school. I'm using this as a random example here instead of finance, but there's a big, if you've got any talent at all, go to theater school so that you can become a movie star and you can be a full-time working actor in Hollywood. And all of a sudden we start cranking out all these BFA graduates from the American schooling system. And there's suddenly 500,000 graduates with a theater degree all going to Hollywood. And there's only, 40,000 full-time acting jobs that exist in that particular city at any given time. So all of those people that don't get the 40,000 full-time acting jobs and get what they view as the natural endpoint for their trajectory of being talented and diligent and hardworking and doing all the strategic right things, they look at the system and go, this system is inherently corrupt. It's inherently evil. We need to break it down. And I'm not doing it on my behalf. I'm doing it on behalf of all of these, the janitor, Pedro, poor guy, that dude. And the lesbians. The lesbians have it the worst of all. Really, that's kind of what's happening is there's this sort of ersatz elite that is unable to get traction and then tries to attack the system in response.
Yeah. And there's this and the book tells this interesting historical story about why it is that they tend to glom onto like social justice narratives to engage in this war out of all those things that they could have possibly, of all the legitimizing narratives that this particular subset of elites could have focused on to try to carry out their campaigns. But yeah, in the nutshell, that's basically what's happening. Yes, a lot of people are who are expecting comfortable lives, who are expecting to reproduce their parents' positions and be able to find a good partner and earn a six-figure income and all of this other kind of stuff, find that they're not able to live the life that they imagined at all, and they channel that frustration and humiliation against the people who are successful in the language typically of social justice. For these interesting historically contingent reasons that I could talk about if you want.
Do we at least get the benefits of the made up stuff? What I mean by that is like Me Too had some really good stuff in it. Yeah. Like Harvey Weinstein was a monster. Like
there's a real problem there. Yeah, it's not the case that there wasn't.
So do we end up using the frustrated would-be elites as rocket fuel to achieve good things, or do they? Eventually does the elite go, well, listen, we're going to let in 20% of you if you'll shut the hell up. And then they come in and they quit doing it? Like, does it fall apart? Yeah. Like, what's the natural result of these reform efforts that happen?
The natural result is more of the second one, unfortunately. So what typically ends up happening is that, the kind of the institutions end up trying to fold in at least enough of the elites to kind of break the resistance or whatever. And they're not usually, as I explained in the book, this doesn't seem to be there's this kind of interesting social coordination process that happens. I'm not sure it's like conscious. Like, I'm not sure a lot of companies are like, yes, let me create X number of roles so that I can make these protesters shut up. I mean, sometimes there is this calculation.
I could totally see that happening though. By the way, I tend to just, let's just assume corporations are evil and greedy. Like I'm fine doing that. So if I'm running the evil, greedy corporation, I'm like, if we create maybe 10 bullshit DEI positions at our company, I think these guys will shut the hell up and we go back to selling sneakers. Let's do that. Yeah. Okay, great. Look, we created a manager of DEI. Is everybody happy now?
Yeah, well, and so like Nixon was pretty explicit about like why he was ending the draft, for instance, is he thought that at the end of the day, a lot of the student protesters were really only concerned about themselves. They didn't want to fight and die, and they didn't really care about a lot of the other issues that they were. And if we just got rid of the draft, they'd all just get jobs and leave everyone alone. And that's basically what happened when he ended the draft. And it was pretty explicit that that's what he was going to do.
He's happy that we just end the draft. They'll shut up about the other things. Fine, we're on the draft. That happened?
Yeah. So often they co-opt enough of them. And then once some of those people get folded into the system, they have the same stake in not having the institution that's giving them a six-figure salary burned down, right? They now have the same set of interests as the people they were formerly criticizing.
So the social justice warrior who previously was saying that universities are a medieval institution grounded in exploitation and patriarchy is now the vice president of women's studies or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, we're working on it from the inside. We're getting there. Don't worry.
Absolutely. And so that's one of the ways they fall apart. And then another way they fall apart is that a lot of these, a lot of the kind of would-be rebels, try to speak on behalf of the marginalized and the disadvantaged, kind of mobilize ordinary people, but they don't really share the same values and interests as most ordinary people. And at the end of the day, what they really want to do is be elites, and they want to tell, even when they're participating in these movements, they want to tell everyone else what they should do, what they should think, and so eventually these differences between normies and elites grow bigger and unstable, and a lot of the and so even the people who don't get folded into the institution, eventually other people just don't want to listen to them or associate with them anymore.
Is there collateral damage from this? So you might get good stuff out of it, right? It might be that let's assume that your theory is correct and that Black Lives Matter, Me Too, these are all the subconscious frictions of erstwhile elites trying to smash the system that has ousted them. But we do get some good things out of it, right? Like I think some, but
not a lot. So
well,
there were some reforms related to, for instance, Me Too, that were I think on balance valuable and useful. One of the problems, though, is a lot of the changes only benefit people who are themselves elites. So most of the policies that and stuff that get changed are in other knowledge economy professional jobs. So you don't see major changes to IHOP or the people who are doing contracting work, building buildings, and things like that. The changes are all in how the New York Times operates, or how Hollywood operates, or how academia operates. And so that's not nothing, but it also doesn't really help people who are genuinely vulnerable and disadvantaged. It just makes it so that elites who belong to certain populations are marginally better off than they would have been otherwise. So and that's
I'm curious about the collateral damage, though. So let's say I've gone to college. I went to Dartmouth, which I think is Ivy League. I graduated from a school that once gave an honorary doctorate to a horse. I'm not part of that at all. I'm from a state school. But I went to Cornell. I'm very confident that's an Ivy League school. I went to Cornell, and I graduated in finance, which is a rich people thing. And I was even on the goddamn rowing team. And so I did all the right things. And I don't have any of this stuff. And so I get out or let's say I went into journalism. How about that? I went into journalism and I get out. And so I start critiquing that I critique these old legacy institutions. The New York Times, which has jilted me, is evil and patriarchal and corrupt. And it's just there to keep people in power until I get in. And it's doing all of those things. So when everybody does this, is that part of why we've had this lack of institutional trust? Because the polling is plummeting in terms of institutional trust with media, government, and higher ed. Basically everything outside of the Pentagon, really. And is it that everybody's like tearing it down, then they get in, and then everybody that is left behind is like, well, I still think it sucks?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a lot of collateral damage of this nature. And there's basically for two reasons. One, because a lot of these knowledge economy professionals themselves, as you said, spend huge amounts of time villainizing, demonizing, criticizing the very organizations that they belong to and hope to eventually get folded into. But then there's this other way in which collateral damage happens, namely that it's typically the case that symbolic capitalists, these knowledge economy professionals, that we tend to be kind of weird compared to most other people. Like the ways that we approach politics, our political views, and all of this are kind of funky compared to most Americans. And this is true in ordinary times. But during these periods of awakening, we tend to change a lot while everyone else is pretty static. And so this gap that's already pretty big grows really big during these periods of awakening between us and normies. And people also come to care about that gap more because we become really hostile about confronting and mocking and denigrating and villainizing and censoring anyone who disagrees with us, anyone who's not on the right side of us, both within our institutions and people who are not in the institutions. And that makes people care about this difference more. It makes them notice that we're very different than them in terms of how we talk and think about the world. And it makes them care about that difference more than they ordinarily would. And this creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs on the right, typically, to kind of campaign on bringing these knowledge economy institutions under control. So higher ed has lost its way. It's just doing indoctrination instead of teaching people useful knowledge and skills. Or journalism is just a propaganda arm for the Democratic Party. It's not telling the truth. It's not, and so on. And so this has two big effects for us. One of them is that a lot of our institutions do then face a lot of pressure from legislatures to where they're defunded, or a lot of the autonomy and freedoms we took for granted get undermined in various ways. And that's a long-term thing we end up dealing with. There's the reduced trust, both from the growing distance and from our own mouths, us saying that our things are terrible. And then people are also seeing us as kind of these wacky, kind of domineering people that they don't trust anyway, just looking at our behaviors. And then the kind of third way in which we get these really bad blowback for us, often is that it creates an opportunity for people to create basically alternative institutions. So after the 1960s awakening, there was this perception that higher ed was lost. There's no fixing it. And so what did people do? They launched right-wing think tanks, starting with Heritage and then Cato. After the 1990s Great Awakening, there was this perception that the media was lost. And so what did they do? They launched Fox News. In the current one, you see Peter Thiel trying to take over Rumble and Elon Musk trying to do this anti-woke takeover of Twitter, Donald Trump launching Truth Social. And these alternative knowledge ecosystems that get created often are, one, devastating for our own viewership. Like Fox News eats everyone's lunch in cable news, and they have been for a long time. And then two, a lot of these institutions, like how they get eyeballs, how they get bread, their bread and butter is basically sowing mistrust in mainstream institutions and fomenting the culture wars indefinitely. Like, how does Fox News keep their viewers? They say all day, every day, mainstream media is lying to you. They're out of touch. They're biased and so on. That's how they get their viewers. That's their bread and butter. And the same with a lot of these other alternative ecosystems that get set up. And so this ends up contributing to this kind of durable polarization and lack of and kind of erosion of trust.
This is great. So I want to play with this, make sure I understand your theory, and I'm going to apply this to the future. And tell me if I'm grasping how this works. So there's an overproduction of elites where too many people are being cranked out on an elite trajectory for a limited number of either status positions or wealth positions or some combination of both. They feel that they have been unfairly jilted from the system, which is therefore corrupt. And so they respond by subconsciously becoming moral purists and self-righteous reformers or revolutionaries. And they do so on behalf of everybody else. But really, it's motivated by a desire to break in to that eliteness. So moving forward, we've got AI. That's probably going to create all sorts of problems. And if AI were to, let's say, to go back to my Hollywood example, if it were to displace a bunch of writers and a bunch of actors to where there really is this glut of people over there, you could see a situation where they come after Hollywood as evil, sclerotic, corrupt, and all of that. Then a bunch of conservative political entrepreneurs go, "You're absolutely right,"
yes.
which is why we're making Branson, Missouri, the conservative Hollywood. And then and it'll just become a thing, but it'll always have an element of, remember, Hollywood's evil. Like even 20 years from now, if Hollywood gets its stuff sorted, Hollywood's always evil. Remember to stay with Branson, Missouri for our patriotic films or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. They'll have the Branson, Missouri will need to constantly distinguish themselves, how they distinguish themselves from what Hollywood is doing. And why should you watch our movies instead of Hollywood's movies? Well, because Hollywood's movies are a bunch of propaganda bull stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So they often do have these kind of, and in fact, another thing that's really unfortunate is that often when we start participating in movements in the particularly outrageous ways that we often participate, because we're trying to get in these status struggles and show ourselves as being the most committed, the most radical, the most whatever, we often engage in participate in these social movements in ways that kill the movements. So, for instance, a colleague of mine, Colleen Aaron, wrote a great book called Reform Nation that was about the passage of the First Step Act, which was one of the most significant, it was like the single most significant piece of criminal justice reform in decades. It was signed into law under President Trump. And what her book shows is that the passage of the First Step Act actually didn't have anything to do with Black Lives Matter or anything like that. It was this careful consensus building over decades from a whole bunch of different stakeholders. A lot of Republicans before the Great Awakening were growing increasingly warm to the idea that the criminal justice system was effed up and there needs to be significant reform in all of this. But then as the Awakening really took off, and especially as this kind of status competition for who's the most woke, who's the most extreme, who's the most radical, eventually led a number of elites to gravitate towards positions like defund the police, abolish prisons, things like that. It actually eroded, completely destroyed this decades worth of consensus building just like that. And so rather than the First Step Act being like the cornerstone, the beginning of this kind of wider system of reforms, it ended up being something that barely limped across the finish line. And then that was it. There was nothing afterwards. And so not only was the First Step Act not a product of the Great Awakening, but the reason why there was nothing after the First Step Act really substantive in terms of criminal justice is precisely because of the kind of moves by activists that alienated a lot of people, including a lot of African Americans and stuff who have real safety concerns. And when they hear things like defund the police or let people out of prison, like, where are the people who get out of prison going to go? It's not to
not a gated neighborhood in a town called Whitehaven. That's not where they're going to go.
Absolutely. And so even a lot of the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of these movements end up getting alienated when symbolic capitalists really get into this kind of super radical competition for who's the most committed and all of this kind of stuff. They actually kill the movements that they take part in, and this is a regular pattern. It's not something that's unusual to the Black Lives Matter case.
And you're going to get people that are gravitating towards those extremist positions because on subconscious level, they're trying to increase their status or break into the elite. And the way to do that, there's a ceiling above me, so I can shift my attention to a kind of moral purity, and I'll get my status through moral purity. Therefore, I'll stake out the most extreme position within our movement.
Because everyone else is doing the same thing, right? Everyone else is also trying to distinguish themselves in terms of their moral purity and stuff. And so you have to, if you want to be better than them, then you have to take a more, if you have this kind of constrained funnel, and a whole bunch of other people are struggling with the same insecurity you are and are trying to climb up in the same way you are, using the same strategy that you are. The main way that you would distinguish yourself is by outflanking them on the left, basically. And so that's what everyone, but since everyone makes that calculation, you get this like wild ratcheting where instead of like, there's this real problem with criminal justice. There's wide consensus across stakeholders that something needs to be done. There's a political opportunity to do that. Let's do some common sense stuff. Instead of doing that, it's let's just burn down all of the prisons and lay off all of the cops, which is like...
Because the goal's not to fix the thing. It's for me to get in the inside. It's for me to get to the VIP room.
It's for you to get the New York Times bylines and this is part of the problem is a lot of the symbolic capitalists don't really have skin in the game to return to that point. If some of these policies did get put into place, they wouldn't be the ones who are suffering and whatever. A lot of these left-leaning places that have affluent enclaves that everyone votes blue, but they hire private security to kind of patrol their neighborhoods, and they're behind gates, and they have key cards you have to use to access a lot of the buildings and doormen that prevent people from coming in. And so, and so they're not the ones who suffer the cost, even if some of this stuff actually gets being put into place. It's disadvantaged people, poor people, non-white people, and so on that end up eating the burden. And so there's nothing constraining them except to the extent that they actually recognize and care about the plight of working people. That would be the only thing constraining them, and that seems to be not a strong constraint.
So I want to get just to make sure I understand this thesis of elite overproduction, because I've heard the phrase before, but this is the first time it's ever been explained to me, and I'm fascinated by this. If we were to go back and look at college graduation statistics in the United States around 1900, it's like 2% maybe that have an undergraduate degree, maybe 5% maximum, but I think it's around 2%. If you go back to that period in American history, if you didn't have a college degree, there was no presumption that you were an idiot or that you wouldn't be successful. College degrees were kind of like Latin, where if you spoke Latin, that's impressive. If you speak Latin, that's impressive. It probably means that you're very well educated and you know lots about philosophy and history. That's really cool. But like no one would go, you're an idiot if you don't speak Latin, and you can't ever have a good job if you don't speak Latin. And then at some point around the 60s, actually right about when the draft was happening, now that I think about it, which would exempt you from going to war, we started doing this really big push of, no, everybody needs to go to college. Everyone needs to be a part of the university system. It's good, knowledge, well-rounded, blah, 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 all of those things. Did we then precipitate the Great Awokening by saying everybody ought to go to college and just cranking everybody through?
Yeah, well, so there's this... real quick on the point about the 1960s. So it's absolute... So one of the things that's striking is that when you look at when the protest movement kicked off in the 60s, it wasn't because of Vietnam, because Vietnam had been going on for years before the protest movement took place, and everyone was fine with it, basically, when it was poor people and minorities and so on who were getting pulled into the draft and deployed into Vietnam. It wasn't the civil rights movement or second wave feminism, all of those things. Like the civil rights movement was going on as well for like a decade before the protest movement and was petering out. Actually, the civil rights movement was petering out as it moved north at that time. all of a sudden people who were like, yeah, go, when they were like fighting in Alabama and stuff, once they start doing stuff in Chicago and New York, they're like, and so it wasn't the civil rights movement. Like all of these kinds of activist explanations for why the movement happened when it did don't really play out chronologically. They don't map on. The thing that changed was when when Johnson said, okay, it's no longer the case that college is an automatic exemption from the draft. Instead, only the best students will be exempted from the draft and everyone else will be folded into this pool. So all of these people who had started going to college, and so you saw this spike, who had been going to college to try to just avoid the war and let poor people and minorities go die, all of a sudden were like, oh, crap. I'm not able to do that. And that's when the activist movement started on campus, was when a lot of middle class and upper middle class people who had been basically planning to just let other people go die in Vietnam suddenly realized that that wasn't an option for them anymore.
Okay.
And
so Nixon was right.
And he was right. After he got rid of the draft, actually it did kill the protest movement. And in fact, you saw a significant decline in college attendance as he was ending the draft, especially among men, because at that time, a lot of men could still get jobs in manufacturing and other things like this, because the kind of transition to the knowledge economy, as we currently say, wasn't really fully underway. That really took off starting in the mid 70s to the early 80s. You start seeing a lot of that big shift to the global order away from manufacturing in Western countries and stuff like this.
With the increase in university fees, and you're an academic, you're at university. I've done several episodes on rising prices of college tuition. Some of it is because we just have more people going through college, and that means that even if you keep the education budget at the state level static, you're dividing it between more people. But that doesn't cover the gap. I've done the math on this. Like the per person funding that has dropped as the size has increased at the state level does not account for the increase in prices at universities. It's not professorial salaries, because professors aren't getting paid any higher.
Yeah. And in fact, a lot of them are being adjunct. Like they're the professors that they're hiring are
you'll get somebody that cobbles together 5 different adjuncts as a way of being an academic full time. But you guys aren't getting rich from this, so a lot of it appears to be going into administration. Now, I've always just assumed that the administration was universities competing with one another to get capital that's made available through Pell Grants and through student loans. But according to your theory, would that be a way for the university to co-opt the elites that can't get into academia, where they start like trying to burn it down and they're like, hold on now, we just decided we're going to create a whole new studies department to grab up some of you? Does that factor in?
Yeah, well, in fact, there's actually this interesting symbiotic relationship between activists and administrators on campus. So like one of the main things that student protesters often ask for is more administration. They ask for more rules and more bureaucratic people to enforce the rules. And they ask for,
we're the resistance. We're the radicals. We want more rules and more bosses to manage our lives because we're the resistance. Yes,
exactly. And they ask for more training, diversity training, and other sorts of anti-bias training and stuff like this, and more diversity offices and more the creation of new, So there's actually this kind of symbiotic relationship between the protesters and the administrators, where the administrators enable and empower the protesters and encourage them, and actually sometimes punish people who don't agree with the protesters. And then on the flip side, the protesters end up calling for basically more administrative jobs and more funding for administrators and an expansion of administrative authority and programming. And so there is this kind of perverse symbiotic relationship between the activists and the administrators that, as you said, one of the primary effects of it, other than the erosion of academic freedom and autonomy, is a ratcheting up of tuition costs and fees. A lot of the high level, like if you're a chief diversity officer, even at University of Michigan or something like that, you often make $300,000 a year or more. Like these are people who are the top 5% of incomes to do this social justice work at an ostensibly public-oriented institution. It's wild. But yeah, so there is this relationship.
So one thing, I love this theory. I'm going to have to just like walk around my neighborhood for 3 hours and absorb everything you've told me today and contemplate your book. I do want to like try to disprove it just out of basic scientific obligation here. So how do we stack up against Europe? I would assume that I believe Europe has higher collegiate education and matriculation rates than we do. Yeah. Do they have more frequent awakenings over there? Does that comport with your theory when you look at that data?
Yeah, so the European case is great. It's a great. Two things. One is that Europe does have a lot of European countries have had awakenings at roughly the same time as the U.S. and for roughly the same reason. So, for instance, Pierre Bourdieu has this great book called Homo Academicus. That's about the Great Awakening playing out in France in the 1960s. And the key argument of the book, actually, it was a big Bourdieu in general is a big influence on me. But the key argument of the book is that a lot of the social justice people in France at the time were making all of these claims in the name of the marginalized and the disadvantaged, but were actually trying to enhance their. So Bourdieu was pointing this out in the 1960s in France. But then even in the current case, like a lot of the same social movements that you saw in the US, you saw in other knowledge economy hubs, including in Europe. Now, that said, and in France, for instance, there's all this tension right now around wokisme, which is funny because they say that wokisme is this American ideology that's infiltrating and destroying France. But like a lot of these modes of thought are themselves kind of poorly translated, terribly implemented versions of French theory that are kind of haunting them. Okay, but there is one difference. The difference is that in a lot of European countries, they actually have more job guarantees. There are less adjunct professors who are getting paid pennies on the dollar. There are a lot more state-funded, relatively stable. And so if you're in somewhere like France or the UK, there are a lot more actual symbolic capitalists. Like you can't earn as much on the high end working as an academic or as a symbolic capitalist or in general, as a journalist, any of that kind of stuff. You don't earn as much on the high end in Europe as you do in the United States. But you also don't have as much precarity at the bottom end.
Got it. So we've got an elite distribution that looks like the Washington Monument, whereas they've got an elite distribution shaped like a pyramid. And so their levels have a broader range, which means they could absorb more potential elites, which means they get less wokeness because they get less friction of erstwhile elites trying to break in.
Yeah, and so the awakenings, when they happen there, they tend to happen roughly the same time because like when you have these global crunches, like the global financial crisis, that didn't just affect America, that affected a lot of other countries because of the kind of global nature of the. But the awakenings in European countries tend to be less pronounced, so they don't last as long because there's less precarity. So you do actually see this when you extend this framework to other countries, it actually does hold up pretty well.
Okay, this is fascinating. So you could make the argument if woke people really, really piss you off, you need to get more government jobs. If truly you hate wokeness and you find it to be an illiberal threat to the Western order, you need to expand governmental jobs to absorb all of the irritating would-be elites so they shut up and get on with their lives. Is that fair?
That's one path. If you want them to be shorter, less pronounced, less extreme, just give them jobs.
Fascinating. Well, then could we also infer then, looking forward, if you ever have a moment where all of a sudden higher education ramps up, where there's suddenly like a 30% jump in master's degrees or a 20% jump in law degrees or something like that, where it's unlikely that the career trajectory will be able to absorb the incoming students or incoming graduates, or if you have an elite profession that is downsized due to AI or automation, both of those are going to precipitate an awakening as the elite try to break down the system they can't get into.
They'll create the incentive for an awakening, but you need the other condition, which is popular immiseration, in order for the awakening to really
right. Because they have to be able to say it's not on my behalf.
Yeah,
it's on behalf of Pedro the janitor.
Look at all these other pissed off people.
He's the one I'm really doing this for.
Yeah, absolutely. All these other pissed off and desperate people. Those are the people I care about. It's not for me.
I'm one of them. As I said, I mentioned I never fly jet. I hardly ever fly business class when I go to Milan.
And I'll say the reason why we do that, the reason why we focus on the marginalized and the disadvantaged in this way, I argue in the book, is because a lot of these professions that we take part in themselves have from the beginning justified the high pay that we get, the autonomy that we get, the prestige that we have. in virtue of the fact that these professions are altruistic, that we serve the common good and especially the marginalized and the disadvantaged. So journalists, for instance, are supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads without regard to anyone's financial or political interests, and so on and so forth down the line. And so the idea was what we explicitly said, a lot of these professionals and professional organizations explicitly said, is that if you give us more wealth and more status and more power, you should do that not for our sake, but because it will be good for everyone. Everyone in society will be better off, including and especially the wretched of the earth. That's been how we've justified our everything from the get-go for these professions. And this has created this unique form of status competition within a lot of these fields, where then people who do an especially good job of portraying themselves as doing good work, of serving the common good, or being advocates or allies for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, or especially seen as especially worthy of occupying prestigious posts, or having their perspectives taken seriously, or enjoying social prestige or high income. And on the flip side, people who are successfully painted as being in the bed with the wrong people, or as being having the wrong views about the wrong groups, or who just seem insufficiently committed to social justice causes or to the ideals that the profession aspires to. Those people often find themselves in a very precarious financial position, and in low status positions, and can even lose their jobs. And that happens a lot too. And so we have this kind of funky mode of status competition in these professions that is a century old. Again, it's not new. It's been going on for a century now. And so that's why when we're in these moments of crunch, we end up gravitating towards these narratives. It's because the professions that we're part of, or that we want to be part of, themselves are oriented around altruism and serving the common good, at least on paper.
I want to be very clear on this with listeners. It's not that I enjoy the flexibility, intellectual curiosity, and fact that I don't have to wake up till 9 if I don't want to, part of my job. I am a truth seeker. I, Andrew Heaton, am pure as the driven goddamn snow. I'm like an angel. And I'm doing this for you. I don't even want to be a podcaster. Really, I want to be a bricklayer. Okay, so on that note, let's then move on. We've been using several terms here, and I want to nail down who the people are. Elite, knowledge worker, and symbolic capitalist. I'm pretty sure symbolic capitalist and knowledge worker are the same thing.
Yeah.
So let's nail down who you're talking about with that, and then we'll get on to who constitutes an elite.
Right. Yeah. So the main subject matter of the book are these constellation of folks that I call symbolic capitalists. So they've gone by other names in the past. They've been known as the creative class, or the professional managerial class, and so on.
Clerisy.
The clerisy. The new class, on and on and on. And so basically, the nutshell definition of who they are is they're people who who traffic in like ideas and knowledge and data and rhetoric and symbols and things like this, instead of providing physical goods and services to people.
Got it. Okay.
So they're people who work in fields like the media or journalism or education or tech or finance or things, consulting,
idea
administration. People who's, and so that's the core.
Okay.
People.
I follow that. That makes sense to me. Okay, yeah. Media, journalism, education, writers, entertainers, people that traffic in knowledge and ideas, as opposed to physically making things. We're doing service economy things like working in a restaurant or something like that. Okay, I follow that. Great. That bit I can follow. How do we define elite? Great. Like who's elite and who's not elite? Because like everyone in America is middle class. It's just a question of how comfortable you are. Like everybody I know that's really rich is like, we're middle class, but we're comfortable. But like
Absolutely.
No one's ever rich.
Absolutely. I show this in the book. There's actually a lot of studies on this. Even millionaires often say that tend to say that they're middle class people who are literal millionaires. Yeah, and so, and in fact, this is one of the big financial cognitive blocks that a lot of symbolic capitalists have, is because a lot of our professions, like journalism, for instance, journalism is defined from the beginning as being in this adversarial position with respect to elites. We're going to hold the elites to account. We're the fourth estate, and so on. And so the fact that we understand ourselves this way, not only as not elites, but as anti-elites in a deep sense, prevents us from recognizing the reality of the fact that our social position, the kinds of salaries and prestige and stuff we have, basically have nothing in common with normal workers. So, for instance, to stick with the case of journalists, journalists today, contemporary journalists, if you look at media companies, prestige media outlets like the New York Times and stuff, they tend to have higher rates of Ivy League graduates than the Forbes 500 billionaires list, than senators, than federal judges. They're like staffed almost near exclusively with people from elite backgrounds. And this is when you look at almost all journalists today have degrees. It used to be the case that you had working class journalists who started in the mailroom at the newspaper and then, kind of worked their way up and became that's no longer the case. And in fact, in order to even be a journalist, and especially at a relatively prestigious firm, and those are some of the only ones surviving, a lot of the other ones are closing or being bought up by these major. So in order to even work at a lot of these jobs, you have to work as an intern first. But who can afford to live for free in these expensive cities where these, like in LA or New York City or somewhere like that, live for free or on peanuts? Well, chances are it's going to be someone who has a lot of income from somewhere else. Their parents are supporting them. They have a nest egg, blah, blah, blah. And so this has interfered with the ability, the fact that journalists are themselves increasingly affluent and people from affluent backgrounds, even if they're not personally super rich, but even again, their incomes tend to be way above normal people, especially for the amount of work that they do compared to normal other people, like the autonomy that we have. But yeah, so this is a problem for journalists because in a world where we're trying to hold the elites to account, but increasingly the millionaires and the billionaires and the wealthy and the powerful and the influential people are people we went to the Ivy League school with, and they're people who are lovers and friends, and we live in the same neighborhoods as them, and we go to the same parties, and you can't really hold them to account in the same way. You actually share a lot of the same interests, a lot of the same dispositions, a lot of the same worldviews.
I know a bunch of people in journalism, and the salaries range. But let's say you're in Washington D.C. and you write for the Washington Post. I'm saying this randomly. I'm not thinking of anybody, but you write for the Washington Post. You've got a byline, and you're pulling around $70,000 a year.
Yeah,
and it's expensive to live in Washington D.C., so you don't feel like you're wealthy, and you're also covering people that are tech billionaires on a regular basis. So those people are the wealthy elites. Does somebody working for legacy media pulling $70K, are they elite, or are they part of below this group that's angry trying to get in?
No, they're elite. For one, I mean, if you're making $70,000 a year, then you as an individual are making more than the typical household in the United States. And so that's just if it's just you. But then typically people who are highly educated and who work in these kinds of jobs also have a partner. They're much more likely to be married. They're less likely to have divorce, and their partners are typically have comparable, also have above average incomes. And so chances are that your total household income is going to be somewhere around 150 or higher, or well into the six figures in any event. And if I could pause you, and feel free to correct me here, Professor, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe the figures at this time are that $67,000 per year is the median income in the United States for a household, for an entire household. Excuse me, it's a median household income for the United States. If you individually are earning $150,000 a year, or as a household with your spouse are earning $200,000 a year, congratulations, you're in the top 10% of all earners in the United States. Yes,
is that about what you've got?
Yeah, and not only do we have a lot of, do they get paid much more than a typical worker, but then also if you look at their working conditions and their autonomy, so they have a lot of prestige, they have influence, powerful people try to get in their good graces so they don't get shitty coverage in the Washington Post. And in terms of their working conditions, like their job is to sit at their laptops or go to places and talk to people and write stuff down. And I mean, you're busy as a journalist, but you're not like, it's not like at Walmart or somewhere like that where you're stocking shelves and you have basically zero freedom over how you spend your time. And there's someone watching you, not even just people watching you sometimes, but often AI systems and cameras and shit like this watching you all the time to make sure that you're productive and on task. And they're collecting a bunch of metrics about you. And if you're not being productive enough, you can get written up or fired at a moment's notice. And if you get fired, it's a big deal for you. And so the kind of working conditions that we enjoy, the autonomy that we enjoy, the prestige that we enjoy has nothing in common with most other workers in the United States. We live very elite lives, setting aside the salary. But even in terms of our salary, even the people who are relatively low compensated in the knowledge professions. So an example I give in the book, adjunct professors are exploited. They're exploited, especially compared to tenure-line professors. They make a fraction of the salary of a tenure-line professor. They have no say in faculty governance. Their job security is really precarious. They can be fired at a moment's notice like this. They have no academic freedom to speak of, as I knew firsthand, getting fired when I was an adjunct for speaking out of turn.
Wait, did that happen at Columbia? Because you were at Columbia last time I spoke to you.
No, that was at University of Arizona before I managed to fail upwards to
Columbia. I was going
Columbia.
to say, Columbia usually ranks higher than Arizona. Good job.
Yeah. I failed upwards. This is a whole wild story of how I ended up at Columbia. But yeah, so adjuncts are exploited. But they're exploited relative to tenure-line professors. But then when you look at the average pay for full-time contingent faculty members, they still earn more individually than the typical household in America. And on top of that, again, like, what do I do as a professor? I stand in front of a room and talk to people about stuff that I'm interested in. That's not, I'm not in the salt mines.
My first job out of college was working on a ranch. I didn't do it for super long, but I did it long enough to know that it's really tiring working on a ranch. Yes. And I don't know what my salary was when you cracked it annually, but it couldn't have been more than $30,000. I think it probably was around $20,000 that I was working for. So
yeah, I was working full time as a shoe salesman and as a retail manager and other things like this before I went to Columbia. I earned more as a graduate student in Columbia, not with a job, just studying there. The money, the chunk change they gave me so I could study and not live on the street was higher than the most that I ever earned working full time in management or sales. So they paid me $38,000 or something like that a year, and the most that I had ever earned working full time before that, full time, was like $35,000. When I hit $35,000, I was like, wow, $35,000. I'm doing pretty good. When
I worked for Congress now 15 years ago, as a Hill staffer, I had a $30,000 income, and I was blown. I mean, I literally lived on a futon, and I was excited. I was like, "This is great! Look at all this money I've got."
Well, and this is the problem. Is I think a lot of knowledge workers, because they look at Bill Gates or Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram X. Kendi or some of these other people who have like Robin DiAngelo does $10,000 a talk or something like that. So they look at people like that and go, "Oh, I'm not rich," and instead of like. They don't have a good understanding of like how much money the typical
if you ever feel frustrated about your job, look at global rates, because we're kicking it. Like, if you're earning $70,000 a year, I want to say you're in the top 10% globally, if not the top 2% globally. Like, you're doing really well compared to the rest of the planet if you're making median income in the United States.
Yeah, even America, though, the median income for an individual, not a household, for an individual is something. I don't want to. It's between $35,000 and like $43,000. It's not.
Right.
It's not. And so people who are making $70,000 for themselves, or more, just as their own individual income, going, "Oh, I'm broke. I'm so poor. Oh, I can't afford anything." It's like. And especially if you're living somewhere like DC or New York or whatever, there's all sorts of people all around you, serving you food, taking you places. Like, what do you think they're earning?
That's a really good point, because that is what my voice would be like. Well, keep in mind though, DC is a lot more expensive. It's like, that's a good point. The person that's delivering me my noodles because I couldn't be bothered to put on pants is not earning $70K. So it almost sounds like there's two different definitions. There's like an internal and an external definition of elite. So like for me, I'm a podcaster. I'm doing better than when I worked on a ranch. I'm in control of my salary, and I'm in an arguably cool field. Like it's depending on who you're talking to, it could be cool. I could be a fun dinner party guest. So if I'm looking at the broader American scope of everybody in terms of earning prestige and autonomy, like on a macro level, they would say somebody like me is an elite, in the sense of compared to everybody else. But when I'm looking at my field in particular, or I'm looking at knowledge workers in particular, and I'm guessing that knowledge workers have a much higher median income than the rest of the country as a whole.
Yes.
Then I can go, well, I'm not an elite.
And the gap is growing over time. We're
right.
becoming,
But I can go, well, I'm not an elite within knowledge workers. Within knowledge workers, I am middle class. But that's because I'm comparing myself to Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I'm comparing myself to Joe Rogan or something like that.
Yeah.
But when I start comparing myself to everyone that lives in my city, elite would be defined as something like above average income, autonomy, and prestige, something like that.
Well, so an easy way, so like a less squishy way of defining.
I'm going to update my dating profile right after you and I talk, by the way. I am an elite media archon.
Absolutely. So the way that a lot of sociologists and economists and political scientists and so on, like if we want to put a number on the elite, so that it's easy to cross-compare and all of this kind of stuff. A good way to do that is to say that basically people in the top 20% are the top 20% of either individual income or household income, depending on whether you want to look at individuals or households. The top 20% is an easy definition of elite. Other people started at the top third. I think they get it to the top third because they say it's like 5 times the poverty rate or something like that is
okay.
And so by that measure, it would be the top third of income earners in the United States, or that's the current distribution. But so basically between the top third and the top quintile of Americans, I think the top quintile is fine. Let's just start with the top 20%.
If you're in the top 20%, you qualify as elite, regardless of whether or not you went to a fancy school. So if you're operating in, if you're in the top 20% of income earners, congratulations, you're in elite. Even if you went to Oregon State University or Northeastern Oklahoma State University or whatever, or you are a manager within the gravel industry, but you're earning $250,000 a year. Absolutely. You're in the top 20%, therefore you're an elite. Congratulations.
Yeah, and so it is the case that the people, when you look at who comprises the top 20%, it's overwhelmingly people with college degrees. It's hugely disproportionately people who work in the symbolic professions.
Right.
But yeah, so if you just say the top, as Richard Reeves showed in his book Dream Hoarders, and a lot of other economists and political scientists and others have shown, if you want to understand a lot of things like declining social mobility, if you want to understand who's actually profiting from the system and how, if you want to understand even looking at the total distribution of wealth, if you look at just the top 1% of income earners, if you just follow the Occupy logic, the top 1% in America controls about 27% of all wealth in the United States. Now, that's a lot. That's a hugely disproportionate share. But it also leaves the vast majority of wealth in America completely unaccounted for.
Many would say about 3/4 based on what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, on the flip side, if you do the top 20%, if you analyze the top 20%, they can collectively control more than 72% of all wealth in America. And the whole rest of it.
That makes me uncomfortable, though, because that seems to implicate me as part of the problem. I rather like it where I am the working man who's entered this ambiguous, maybe elite status fighting against the billionaire. When you make it sound like I am part of the group that disproportionately controls wealth, it makes me sweat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, like the whole rest of the 80% of America just has to make do with less than a third of the wealth in this country. The top 20% controls 72% of it. If you look at the top 20%, then you get a really you have a really robust understanding of who's profiting, of who the winners are, and more than that.
Well, so Musa, go ahead, please go.
Yeah, real quick. One of the other problems with focusing on the millionaires and the billionaires, like we like to do, is that a lot of the things that we have a problem with, we actually can't really explain if we just look at the millionaires and the billionaires. So, for instance, there's this guy, Anand Giridharadas, wrote this book called Winners Take All, which is about how rich people basically leverage money and nonprofits and stuff to present themselves as a solution to problems that they themselves helped create or exacerbate. Okay, so that's a good book, but like, how do they do this concretely? If we like, who is it that runs the PR firms through which they launder their reputation? Oh, that's symbolic capitalists. Who is it that's providing them the fawning media profiles that they're relying on to launder their reputation in the Washington Post and New York Times? Oh, that's symbolic capitalists. Who is it that runs the nonprofits and administers the nonprofits through which they're laundering their reputations? Oh, that's us, the symbolic capitalists. Who is it that's helping them launder their finances? Like through offshores and all these fancy shell games and all of this. Oh, that's also us, symbolic capitalists. So if you want to understand all of this terrible, the voodoo that all of the 1% and the millionaires and the billionaires do, it's with us and through us that they accomplish that. And it's not just, and this is true for almost anything. The terrible things that multinational corporations do. Who is it that's occupying the C-suite? Who is it that's designing and implementing a lot of these terrible policies? Symbolic capitalists. When you look at the terrible things that the government does, who are the lobbyists? Who are the advisors? Who are the, it's symbolic capitalists.
Who's the podcasters giving them cover? Me.
Absolutely. Even the millionaires and the billionaires are increasingly pulled from our industries. They're people who work in fields like tech and finance and media and so on. And so like there's this kind of story that we tell where we try to separate ourselves from those people, but everything we hate that those people are doing is with us and through us that they're able to accomplish those things. And so by focusing on just the 1% or the millionaires and the billionaires, we tell ourselves this really convenient but false story that exempts us, that kind of conveniently elides the role that we play in almost everything that we hate about society. And last point that I'll say on this, our second favorite trick, when the millionaires and billionaires thing doesn't work well enough, then we blame those MAGA people, those red state bastards, the racist, sexist, authoritarian. But here's the thing. If aliens came to Earth and abducted literally everyone who pulled the lever for Donald Trump, a lot of the problems that we're concerned with wouldn't change at all. Because a lot of the problems, like if you look at things like racialized inequality or income inequality, they're actually most pronounced in blue states and in blue cities that Democrats control with basically one-party rule. So like in New
California,
New York, yeah. 1 out of every 12 people in both of those states, 1 out of every 12 people is a millionaire.
Wait,
a millionaire.
What? 1 out of every 12 people in California, New York is a millionaire?
Yes, and they also have the highest poverty rates in the country. California has the highest poverty rate in the country. New York has the most racially segregated schools in the country. Both of them have higher levels of racialized inequality than the high levels of segregation. All of these things that we're concerned about, racialized inequality, gender exploitation, socioeconomic inequality, they're far worse in cities and states that Democrats control with one-party rule. We can't blame MAGA. There's no opposition that liberals in New York have. There's no MAGA opposition that liberals in New York have to anything that they're, or people in California or anything like that. It's Democrats. It's in particular, it's the knowledge economy professionals who fund these Democratic politicians and are hugely concentrated in these cities that are responsible for a lot of these problems. And so this is, again, we tell these stories about those people, the millionaires and the billionaires and the MAGA people and all of this kind of stuff. But if we really want to understand a lot of these social problems, it's us. We're the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm very much with you on that, because I think people like me who are apt to own a home in a knowledge hub city like Austin, Texas, or Washington, D.C., or San Francisco, or Los Angeles, or New York, if we own a home, we want to protect that asset, and therefore we are going to zone the entire place to make sure that nobody puts in any poor people homes near where I live that will lower the cost of my home. And there's this weird phenomenon, it's not fully understood, but there's this weird phenomenon in economics where if you drive up the costs of homes, the cost of homes increases. No one knows why, but it seems to be this weird correlation where if you use the full scale of government to artificially restrict supply in order to make your house cost more, houses cost more.
Yeah, absolutely. My apologies.
You're okay.
Yeah, well, and actually, and so this is the core tension that I highlight in the book. I think this is the big struggle that is that on the one hand, I think most people who participate in the knowledge professions are sincerely committed to social justice. Like I think when we say we want the oppressed to be liberated, we want the poor to be uplifted, and all of this kind of stuff, we mean it. It's not like we actually like the but the fact that this is a sincere commitment, it comes into clash with this other sincere commitment we have, which is that we want to be elites. We think that our opinion should count more than the checkout clerk at Stop and Shop. We think that we're entitled to a higher standard of living than most people. We want our children to reproduce our own social position or do even better than us. And this desire to be an elite is in fundamental tension with this other desire for social justice, right? You can't be an egalitarian social climber. That's a contradiction in terms. And so this desire, when they come into conflict, it's our desire to be an elite that usually wins out and kind of transforms our pursuit of social justice, so that we focus on ways to pursue social justice that don't require us to sacrifice or change anything. And especially what we would like is a pathway that we can achieve a lot of these justice goals just by taking stuff from other people, which is why we focus on the millionaires and the billionaires.
We're the hating on the MAGA faithful at the download. Like I haven't really thought about this that much, but let's say I become kind of aware of this contradiction in myself that I am an aspiring elite who's making significantly above the median average median income, and then I look at people in West Virginia. And I go, oh wow, I have such a better time than them. Oh, maybe, and like for real, I'm a very pro free trade guy, but like, is there something to that? But then I can go, they're bigots.
Yeah,
that's you know what, like I believe the right things, I do the right things. They're knuckle dragging. They're part of a backwards culture. Therefore, they're mired in that stupidity. If only they would do the same. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I could see that being a way to justify things.
This is one of the perverse things. This is one of the main ways that we mobilize social justice discourse these days, is to justify inequalities, literally to justify inequalities, that the people who are the losers in the knowledge economy, the people who are suffering, the people who are excluded, the people who feel like they don't have a voice and a stake in our institutions, well, guess what? They don't deserve one because they're racist, because they're sexist, because they're authoritarian, and so on. And there's research that shows, for instance, when you teach people about white privilege, which is the idea that white people are born with this inherent advantage in virtue of their skin color that other people do not possess. When you inculcate that view into people, it doesn't cause them to think about non-white people any differently than they did before. It doesn't cause them to treat non-white people any differently than they did before. The main effect that the training seems to have is it leads them to think about poor white people even worse. Like,
really?
Those people really deserve. They had all this privilege, and they're still poor. Then they deserve to be poor. I mean, like, they were born white. They should be rich. Why aren't they rich? Like, that's the main effect that it helps them justify. And this is a very convenient view for elites to hold, right? Because a plurality of poor people in the United States are white. So it's a very convenient view for the winners in the prevailing order to think that the largest share of poor people in America actually don't deserve anything. We don't need to reallocate anything to them. We don't need to worry about their plight or their social condition. In fact, they probably have more than they have. They have more than they deserve. That's a very convenient position for the winners in the knowledge economy to hold, that the losers don't deserve anything. We don't have to worry about the poor because they're white, or that they're men. When you look at a lot of social misery indexes, men are doing terrible compared to women. The trend lines are all very negative. Like if you look at underemployment, unemployment, the likelihood to live alone, the likelihood to be incarcerated, the likelihood to experience violence, deaths of despair, so on and so forth. Not only are men much worse than women in all of these categories, but they're growing, but the gaps between men and women are growing larger all the time. So if we have this narrative that, forget about men suck, men deserve, if men are suffering, then good, men are suffering, they deserve it, and so on. Again, that's a convenient narrative for us to tell. It means that the losers, the people who are losing and suffering and getting left behind in this transition to the knowledge economy, we don't actually have to worry about them. They're a bunch of patriarchal, male-privileged people who haven't been taking advantage of their gender and the way that they should have. and we should actually just keep worrying about other people instead. So we tell all of these kinds of narratives that allow us to dismiss the suffering of the people who are excluded and marginalized in the knowledge economy in the name of social justice. And that's really perverse, but it's just how this rhetoric functions in the world. It's part of its social life.
That is fascinating, is social justice as a smokescreen for inequality. When I lived in New York City, I dated a gal from Oklahoma. We're both from there, but we met in New York City. And at the time we were dating, if she wanted to call her father, she had to call her neighbor, and her neighbor would go across the street to her father's house because he was so poor he didn't have a phone. It wasn't some David Thoreau, I read an article in the Atlantic about not having a smartphone situation. He couldn't afford a phone. And this is like 10 years ago. So like, I'm willing to acknowledge that I've got a lot of privilege in life, but I don't feel comfortable saying it about that guy. I like that dude, who's probably super conservative, by the way, because I know where he's from and I know how people vote there. But I would feel very odd castigating him as somebody that has really benefited from modern society and privilege, given that he can't afford a phone.
Well, and actually there is a difference. This is one of the things I point out in the book is actually there is a difference in terms of even if we just run with the racial privilege narrative, it's not the case that everyone gets the same mileage out of their whiteness. So I give this example of the fact that I'm 4 inches taller than the typical American man. There's all sorts of research that tall people have all sorts of completely unearned advantages in life. They earn more money. They're better on the dating market. People take them more seriously, more authoritative, and all of this kind of stuff. And I didn't meritocratically earn my height. I don't deserve it. It's an accident of early nutrition and genes and stuff like this. Okay. But here's the thing. If I lived in a community where everyone else was also 6'3", I wouldn't have any advantage. My height wouldn't advantage me. I wouldn't be, even if I was still that much taller than the national average, if in my local community, most other people were the same height as me, I actually wouldn't have any advantage in working or dating or any of that kind of stuff. How would I get the most advantage of being taller than the national average? Well, it would be to move to a community where most people are shorter than the national average, or even just a community where most people are average. There, I would actually be able to leverage this privilege that I have because I'm surrounded by a whole bunch of people who don't have that privilege. And so in the same way, if you're a white person who's in a community that's mostly other white people, in a state that's largely white people, and all this kind of stuff, you actually, even setting aside the socioeconomic question entirely for right now, you just don't have as much racial privilege as a white person who lives in a place that's full of other non-white people, over whom they can leverage that privilege.
That is fascinating. So if you're living in the great town of Longstain, Missouri, in a county that is 95% white, your white privilege has less utility for you than to pick a random location, New York City, where if America truly is, if it truly is systemically racist, you're getting more bang for your buck in New York City or Washington, D.C. than you are in Longstain, Missouri.
Not even close. Yeah, absolutely. It's massively more. And so this is one of the ways that again, we leverage social justice discourse to mask what's actually happening sometimes. So if we tell this story about privilege where all white people need to confess their privilege, all white people have the same privilege, like these kinds of stories that progressives often push actually obscure the reality that they themselves probably actually benefit more from their race than most other Americans do, certainly more than Americans who live in communities that are more racially homogenous.
Oh, wait, does this work for careers too? Because like my guess is like bricklaying's not 99% white. But my guess is that knowledge economy is probably more white than the average American. Is my guess that there are certain Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the big ironies that I highlight in the book is that a lot of these, almost actually literally all of the knowledge professions, despite being places where progressive ideology, anti-racism, feminism, all of this kind of stuff is more prevalent. And not just more prevalent among the people who work there, but is institutionalized. Like the companies issue statements and they have all these policies and blah, blah, blah. But they actually tend to be a lot more racially parochial than most other workplaces in the United States. They're far more likely they're far disproportionately white compared to the rest of the country, and even more so compared to the communities that they're based in. So a lot of them are consolidated into cities like New York and Los Angeles and stuff like that. Those cities are even way more diverse than America as a whole. So these companies and institutions are already not diverse, even just looking at US baselines, but relative to the communities in which they're actually embedded, they're even less representative. Far less representative than basically any other line of work. They're some of the most racially parochial places and actually part of the reason why they're so racially parochial, frankly, is because they're so focused on people having the right credentials, and especially credentials from elite schools. There's a lot of, so for instance, if you have a job that requires an arbitrary bachelor's degree, then you're excluding right out of the gate. Something like 90% or more, I think, of African Americans. And if you require a master's degree, it's like 95% of African Americans or more, just right out of the gate. Even higher shares of Hispanics. And a lot of these jobs that require college degrees, I mean, most people who have college degrees who work in jobs that require college degrees, they don't have degrees that are relevant for the job at all. I mean, a lot of these positions, you can have a degree in art history, you can have a degree in STEM, and it doesn't matter. They just want that piece of paper. And so we've
designed a system where if you don't graduate from university, you're kind of dumb. You're kind of a loser. And so, I guess get at the back of the line, loser. You should have gone to college, because that's what we designed the system to do.
Yeah, you're not viewed as being taken seriously, being part of the institutions. And that has... because the distribution of education credentials in the United States is not random, but instead flows from a whole bunch of historical patterns and ongoing contemporary patterns in terms of who has access to safe communities, good schools, parental support, and blah, blah, so on and so forth. There are all these factors that contribute to who gets into college, who goes to college, who actually graduates from college once they enroll, and so on. And so one of the things I highlight in the book is that even though a lot of the rules that allowed for outright racial discrimination, in the past, a lot of jobs were restricted exclusively to whites. And in fact, a lot of the symbolic professions from the beginning, like the American Bar Association, didn't allow Black lawyers and aggressively tried to break up because they didn't allow Black lawyers. A lot of Black people were like, okay, well, maybe we'll start our own legal association, and they would break those up too. So not only would they not admit Blacks, but they would prevent Blacks from creating their own. And this is true for a lot of this, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, so on and so forth. So a lot of these jobs were exclusively for WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, especially WASP men. They were unapologetic in excluding non-whites, religious minorities, and so on. As those laws broke down, following the Civil Rights Acts, affirmative action, Title IX, things like this, and it became impermissible to legally exclude people in this way.
But we could go, I say we because I'm a white Anglo-Saxon former Protestant WASP. As a WASP, we would go, listen, we can't keep the Blacks out anymore, but we're only going to admit people that went to Dartmouth or higher from now on to these particular jobs. You had to go to the right school. We're completely agnostic to skin color.
Yeah.
But we're going to really increase credentials that happen to sort for the exact same things we were previously sorting for.
Absolutely. So they sort, so you still have the quote unquote right people getting in from their minds, but in a way that's formally race neutral. It's formally race neutral to have a degree requirement. But as David Autor and some others have shown, the shift from overt discrimination to focusing on credentials and degrees, it actually in practice, if not by intent, but just as a practical consequence, it actually has almost the same effect as a lot of the overtly racially discriminatory policies had. And in fact, when you look at a lot of statistics, as I show in the book, things like the share of Black Americans who are incarcerated or Black-white income gaps, or a lot of things like this, there's been basically no change since the mid 1960s, when a lot of these when this transition to the symbolic economy really took off. there's been almost no progress, and in some ways it's even worse than it was, despite the fact that Americans today are really unlikely to hold racist views. Like if you actually convince someone who works in academia that they made a hiring decision based on race, they would be mortified. Like, it's not the case that they're like secretly racist, and this is like they don't want to they don't agree with racism anymore. We're past that.
Right.
Like, they would be like horrified, mollified. They would probably go out and try to find some way to make it better. But despite the fact that no one is trying to, or almost no one, okay, we'll just hedge our bets. Almost no one is trying to explicitly exclude people on the grounds of race or ethnicity, and in fact would be horrified to know that they're doing that. In practice, that is what they're doing by this focus on superfluous degrees. And
that makes sense. I think that's a bit like zoning. To go back to my earlier bugaboo, most zoning laws in the country were explicitly racist. They were designed to keep black people from going into white neighborhoods. I don't think that zoning laws that are here today are being promulgated by bigots trying to keep black people out of their neighborhoods, but it's what it came out of, and it still has that effect of like if income is correlated with race, and it is, that means that when you're having those laws put in place, you're also going to be keeping out certain races. So I don't think that people that are in San Francisco trying to really overzone everything are doing it out of a sense of bigotry. I don't think that at all. I think that they're probably very, very concerned with not being bigots, but the effects of that institutional element remain despite what the intentions now are.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to give you a potential out here, Professor. I want to speak to you more. However, we've already gone over what I kind of promised you we were going to do. So if you want, we can wrap up now. I would love to talk to you about how people in the in the symbolic capitalist class think. I would love to get your thoughts on that. Can I keep you for another 15 minutes or schedule a bonus interview at some point in the future? Or do you want to pull the ripcord? I won't be mad. I'll read your next book.
No, I could stay for another 15 minutes. Sure.
Great. Excellent. Good. Okay. So then what I want to do is we can get into the politics of people that are in the knowledge class, the clerisy, the symbolic capitalists. But I want to backdoor my way into this via dating, because you have a whole chapter on how people in the symbolic capitalist class, the knowledge workers, date. So how does that work? How are people that are symbolic capitalists dating differently than the rest of the country?
Yeah, so there's a few ways in which they date differently than other people. One is that we really prioritize.
Well. Looks like Musa and I are going to continue talking over on the bonus episode about what all this looks like in terms of dating, sex, how the overproduction of elites affects marriage, and lesbians. We get into lesbians. So you know what? I'm not going to lie to you and tell you, aw, shucks, folks. I'm just a little old podcaster. Please pay my meager salary. Enough of this man of the people bullshit. I'm part of the elite. I'll own it. And if you want to hear me talk to another elite guy, Musa, about elite dating and lesbians and how I stack up in all of this, maybe whether or not I make enough money to afford 2 wives, well, you'll just have to become an elite member of the orphanage yourself. I'm going to dangle this in front of you. I'm not going to lie to you. It's a really good chat. It's fun. I let my hair down a little bit. We keep talking, but you don't get to hear it unless you become elite too. And you can become an elite member of the Political Orphanage by going to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Now, if you want to stay a bog standard listener, basic orphan, that's cool. I'm happy you're here. Genuinely, I'm happy you're here. But all the elite orphans who love the show and want to support it, like dukes or steel magnates from the 19th century, paying court composers and whatnot, you want to be one of them, go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. Because you're not just going to be elite. You're going to get something out of it. You'll get bonus episodes every week going back 5 straight years. Musa and I keep talking. We do a whole nother hour, so you're getting, if you like this episode, you're getting part 2 of this episode. And we get into not just the sex lives of knowledge workers, which I hope sounds salacious enough that if it doesn't convince you to come over and become a patron, it at least really irritates you not to hear it. That's my goal. You either give me money or feel bad. I want everybody listening to either give me money at this point or feel bad. So grab a cigar, Get yourself a brandy snifter, quit hanging out with all the other peasants in steerage, and come chill with me and Musa in the mahogany-filled VIP Patrons Lounge. Go to patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's patreon.com/Andrew Heaton. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Musa al-Gharbi, for coming on. His book has been We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Italy. Check it out. You can find that and all of the books discussed on this program by going to mightyheaton.com/featured. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. And thank you, elite patrons of the show who make it all possible, regardless of your wokeness or lack thereof. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.